Welcome to another episode of Cooperant Learning. We have two guests today. They are both two out of the three authors of the 2022 article, LGBTQ plus conversion therapy and applied behavior analysis, a call to action. This was published back in 2022, is one of the top cited articles in the journal that year. They have an upcoming book chapter focusing on LGBTQ plus clients in person-centered planning and are both currently completing PhDs. Sarah Campau and Abby Petronelli, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Would you both, we're going to dive into a lot of stuff, but would you both take just a couple minutes to introduce yourselves, talk about your current research interests and kind of how you came into the field?
Ms. Petronelli, would you like to go first?
Oh, sure. Well, hello. My name is Abigail or Abby Petronelli. I am my pronoun indifferent, so she, he, they doesn't matter to me. I am currently a PhD student up at Western Michigan University in the Industrial Organizational Behavior Management department or program. I would say broadly, my research interests are related to DEI. I've done some research related to pronoun use. So I have an article published, I believe, in 2022. I should probably know my own citation.
I checked earlier. It is.
Yeah, on use of, it's the only one. It's the only one right now. So we're looking for more. Getting people to use proper pronouns in this simulated task. And I'm currently working on some more DEI related research for my dissertation. I'm not going to get into specifics because I don't. There's gonna be some secretness with it, and so we're also gonna see where it goes. Maybe I don't get any good data, and we're just gonna pretend I didn't do it. That's broadly my interest. Obviously, I'm in the IOBM program, so I would say beyond, DEI, just in workplace settings, it's also kind of in broader society as well, and then just kind of well-being in an organization. So a lot of complex things I'm interested in.
Well, you're at home. You're with a lot of fellow Broncos, I think, in the room. So
I went there for my undergrad, so yay me, in travel and tourism.
May I ask whose lab you're in?
I'm in Dr. McGee's lab.
Tell her I said hi. She loves me, or at least she pretends to. So we're good there.
And do.
And to introduce myself, my name's Sarah Campau, and I have been a BCBA since 2017. I've only worked almost exclusively with adults with severe problem behavior. I started in brain injury rehab and then have done a lot of IDD work, and I'm currently working at the psychiatric hospital here in Grand Rapids. My research interests are a combination of both like LGBTQIA and different ways that we can better advocate for our clients and for the people we serve, but also how does policy and how do outside agencies interfere with our abilities to practice or practice ethically, or what influence does policy have? Because I think was a huge area in behavior analysis that's kind of not being addressed or being addressed in a way that I would like to address it. And so, I decided very intentionally to choose policy because I think that there's a lot of room for our field to grow and become better, and that will happen through policy.
I like it. Sarah and I met, Steve and I gave a presentation back in February on restrictions, rights, and just essentially how to navigate social validity in the adult sector. And I think we freaked a lot of people out, but Sarah wrote us like, let's talk more. So it was fun to find some like-minded folks for sure.
Yeah, the adult world is very small, and then the people who understand the adult world is even smaller.
Yeah. I think we accomplished our mission that day, but it wasn't without a lot of follow-up questions from a lot of people. So
I always love to take an opportunity to freak people out. So whatever you can do.
Well, let's get into it then. It's been a few years since your conversion therapy article came out. Do you mind kind of reminding everybody what that article was, what your goal was with that article, and why it was so important at that time that it reached kind of the broader context of ABA, the field as a whole?
I can go.
Do
We're
it, Sarah.
both like giving each other eye contact through computers, so it's not working as well as it does in person. The paper came out of what we saw as a need and a conversation that was, it actually started happening after we had started our papers. It felt like we were writing, and then all of a sudden the stuff about the ABAI position statement started happening, and like these other, like the rumblings were rumbling everywhere. So we were like, we got to get our paper out because we had been working on it for so long, and we were really happy to get out there. And what we really wanted to do was set the foundation for some of these conversations so that people can understand the issue at hand, which is a history of treating homosexuality as a behavior that could be changed. We have significant literature published on it and not against it. And this idea of maybe we can all go around and say that we don't do that anymore. But for people who are really like evidence-based things, there isn't a lot of evidence that we're not doing that anymore. And so we really just wanted to set up the ability to have the conversation, especially as different policies and things were coming out and still are related to DEI and our responsibility as clinicians to the people that we serve, and looking at in a broader, more cultural standpoint, and recognizing that the people we serve may be apprehensive for very good reason. Because if you were to Google search ADA and LGBTQ or ABA and gay, it's overwhelmingly negative. And I'm not here to say that they're wrong. What I'm here to say is that we need to be better. And I think that's really how the papers came about. And I think that was the intention in writing it. And I think it became part of that big conversation that was happening right in 2022 around Riekers and Lovaas and the retraction. And we knew those things were happening, but it's bigger. We've always said it's bigger than one paper. It's bigger than one clinician. It is a lot more prevalent in our literature than many realize. And so we just wanted to set the bigger stage, because so much of the conversation was based on retraction, not retraction, and that is a valid debate to be having, but it's not the core of the issue. The core of the issue is so much bigger. And so we really wanted to get that through in our paper as well.
Yeah, I know in the paper, or when did it come out? Like timeline? Because there was a statement of concern. Was that how it was worded? Did that come out like right before it was
Yeah,
published?
so we were actually in the middle of writing, having kind of, I think, a different scope to begin with. And then I think I probably still have the text somewhere from Sarah, either you or Danny, who was like, guys, LeBlanc just came out with something. I think it's over. And I think we had a panic session, if I recall. I think that would be very us.
Yeah.
And I think with that, we, kind of listened to what some people said, because after that prompted a series of people posting comments online of some podcast discussing it and discussing the retraction of Riekers and Lovaas. And, we sat and had a discussion. And I think from that, our scope shifted a little bit to have kind of those broader ideas of like, yeah, like, we can talk about Riekers and Lovaas. There's so much more. Like, even like there's an article by Cody Morris and colleagues that goes into history. There's still more beyond that. A really good way to find some awful history is to go to the articles, find the well-known articles, go to their references, because you will get down a rabbit hole. They're just maybe not in our seminal journals anymore.
Gotcha.
There's other places, but like, oh, that's a multiple baseline. That's a reversal. I know what that is. It's not in JABA. It's not, it's not in these journals that we like know and love very well, but these are our principles in action, just somewhere else. And so, yeah, so that article from LeBlanc and Statement of Concern had come out first. We were hearing some discussions on it, and from that kind of reframed our approach, in which we're like, hey, it's bigger than that, because let's just say all of the articles have that retraction. And we have equality, y'all. That's not how that works. It goes beyond that. I don't, doubt that retraction as a symbol is important. I don't want to take that away from people, but it's so much bigger than that, because retraction is, related to a journal. How does that impact practice, though? And we are a science practitioner model, but a retraction of a journal article or several, even, which I will note, none have been retracted. There's a statement of concerns on Rikers and Lobos.
Yeah.
But even if there were, that still doesn't give guidance for practitioners or researchers of how to actually be inclusive and actually practice in a culturally competent way.
Sure. You called for a few things in that article. I'm just going to kind of read it here. The purpose of the paper was to call for multiple additional specific action steps, which researchers, practitioners, and organizations in behavior analysis can take to further address our field's historical ties to conversion therapy and use our science to better support and advocate for LGBTQ plus people in the future. It's a couple years later, just curious kind of what your views on, since that article came out, are we doing that?
I would say that we're doing it on a micro level. Like, it's not the sweeping change that Abby or Danny and I would love to see, but there is now an LGBTQ SIG as part of ABAI, and that was something that was really important. We really saw the need with younger practitioners who are doing the Google and finding this really strange history and not knowing what to do with it. And then there are people who just want to advocate for their own communities, BCBAs with autism and BCBAs that are LGBTQ. They're trying to make their space in a field that has not always been friendly to them. And so I think it's really encouraging to see like a coming together, and they even have a list of the upcoming ABAI sessions that are LGBTQ related. And I think those types of things are great changes, but we're still pushing up against a system that isn't wholly accepting of those changes. For example, the pronoun pins at ABAI were, and I don't know if they still are because I have withdrawn my membership, but they were provided by attendees. And the organization couldn't accommodate the variety of pronouns. And that's such a not true statement that it makes it really difficult to totally be in on all the changes that have happened. Like, there's change, but it's slow moving, and it's still an active fight for the littler things, I would say.
Sure.
Abby,
anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're hearing some more discussions on it than maybe we were before. And I maybe this is my own bias and perspective, but yeah, I mean, Sarah, like at any time, like I think you and Danny did some workshops, and then I had some people I talked to as well that like they read this paper, they're like, oh my gosh, give me all the information because I don't know where to start. And it's hard to know how many people in practice and research are like in that position until they come up and tell you, I don't know where to start. And so I think people are wanting this information, but of course we're also in a system, both within the field, but also beyond that, that is restricting a lot of specific work recommendations around topics like LGBTQ plus people, so that's an additional barrier. So there was already a barrier in place, and I think we're talking about it more now, but I think it is on a much smaller scale. For a variety of reasons, largely systems and policy related. Call back to Sarah.
Yeah, well, and I'd be remiss not to mention, and let's just dive into it, the removal of DEI requirements in continuing ed, and in our education background, BCBAs that are coming up aren't going to be required to get the same DEI requirements that we had, which affects a lot of different groups of people for sure. What are some of the potential consequences of that shift, from your perspectives, particularly for, a lot of folks who are, just already vulnerable? So, we work with folks in, adult residential settings. Like, there's already a layer of vulnerability there. And it seems like this is just adding to that layer.
I guess I'll go first. Sarah's pointing at me. Yeah, that was a statement. That was in fact a statement. I really wrestle with a lot of it because, like, do I think them having DEI CEU specific requirements was going to be the savior of the field? No, I don't. I've heard some people kind of critique some like DEI stuff that they've seen that they're like, it's still not, I still don't really understand like practical applications of that. So would that have solved everything? No. But does that send a message from the field? The BACB is the certification board, and do all behavior analysts have that certification? No.
Right.
But it is the major one. And I think when most people think about behavior analysis, like, oh, like what are some major organizations you think of? You think BACB is one of them. And so this pulling back of it, it says a lot. I'm not in that board. So, I was not in the room. Nobody knows who was in the room.
Right.
They're
Right.
transparent on that. That's kind of a big thing as well. I think there
Yeah.
was maybe a 15-minute, somebody fact check this, podcast that the head of the ACB did.
It was
put out
11
there.
minutes, to correct you.
Oh, it was 11? Oh,
I believe so.
Yeah, and again, I'm, with a lack of transparency, kind of hard to know what were the actual factors here. I'm open to hearing like what were the actual barriers there, but again, did you make efforts to kind of work around this? Look at the APA, American Psychological Association. They did have to pull back some stuff, but their framing and how they worded, they're like, we don't want to do this, and they have a little bit of workarounds to doing that. Why can the board not do that? And I heard, I talked to some people about it, and they had said, well, it's kind of not within the board's power. I'm like, okay, so then our certification board system sounds highly flawed. Like that still doesn't negate systematically in our certification process, there are problems. If our major certification board cannot stand with its practitioners, and then it's probably not a good one. And I will say, I say this as somebody who is not certified. So maybe I'm going to be a little bit more blunt, because I don't have certification. Can't take away what I don't have.
Here's someone that is certified, and they can take it if they feel the need to. But I think they always went historically back when we first got, those of us that have been around a little bit longer, first got certified. It was a system to support and help behavior analysts. And when leadership moved on and new leadership took over, it felt like it was much more, they felt it was illegitimate and legitimate. I shouldn't have tried to say that word out loud in front of people. Made it more legitimate to make it all legal and not be helpful to behavioral analysts anymore. You hear grumblings from big name people here and there, like it's like a coup is starting somewhere because they're not okay with what's happened in this. But I still couldn't understand when that came out. The grumblings were some states were saying, oh, we won't let BCBAs provide services. We won't recognize the certification if you keep it in. I'm like, then hide it. Put it somewhere else. Don't take away. I mean, let's put it in, the actual coursework that you're required, or in the ethical guidelines, and that way it's not just a DI policy, but it's just part of what we do. And that is what kind of bothered me, that there wasn't a different approach to protect people.
Yeah, and it's not like they ever have any specific recommendations anyway. If you look at anything DEI related, it's super, super general stuff and doesn't, again, give practitioners any form of guidance. So it was already a flawed system of like people. I'm going to cite back to my thesis. I take it on the road with me everywhere. It had a subtle cue condition where if you just tell people be inclusive, that didn't change any specific behavior. Like that doesn't give anybody any specific direction. So was it already good? No, but this statement just makes it a whole lot worse. Like it doesn't show you're trying with it. And am I going to sit here and say there's a bunch of horned people at the BACB? No, I don't know them.
Yeah.
But they cannot be upset when people push back on that. Like your statement said a lot. You tried to hide it, seemingly. And it didn't seem like that you were standing with the community. Again, it seems like you're more focused on like the legal certification. Okay, well then this is again a problem with your system. If you cannot stand by your practitioners and the communities and marginalized communities, both of the practitioners and of the clients, what good are you? You just, what good are you?
I would like to put on my policy hat for a second and explain both. I did go back and re-listen to that little podcast because in preparation and just to kind of hear their standpoint again. This decision is based around the political atmosphere in universities and colleges, because as they are being required to root out DEI, root out specific language, specific, they're being challenged by the administration to eliminate certain coursework. If those schools, which they are on largely, cave to these ideas, then they can no longer offer the DEI that we're requiring for certification, which means that program or that school can no longer certify BCBAs because they won't be able to meet the DEI requirements, because on a national scale, DEI is not allowed. It's a business decision, because you will lose a ton of schools that are unable to continue with the BCBA and the BACB. And this is a money legal organization. And so for them, as like putting the policy hat on and even listening to kind of them trying to describe why they're doing it, the unspoken elephant in the room is we're getting rid of DEI. So we can't require DEI, because then we won't have those organizations paying into us, those organizations continuing to train our practitioners. And it will end up being this big case by case, state by state, school by school thing with exceptions. Does that mean that they did it right, or that they didn't have other options? I don't think that they did it right. I do think there was even a more transparent way to discuss the decision. Be very clear that this decision is not reflective of behavior analysis, but is reflective of a political system that is currently taking away this thing that we're preemptively taking away so we don't get in trouble, or so that we can continue to have certificates. One of the things that I got alarmed with when I was listening to the podcast explanation was the comment that we went to the people who help us with our licensing, and they said we couldn't have two different routes. And to me, I then back up and go, oh, so who is your boss then? And let's talk to like why. I understand, but can you have more transparency around this? And that's one thing that the BACB, in my opinion, is terrible at, is transparency, ethical transparency especially. We don't get to know who's in the room. They get to pick their own subject matter experts. We don't get to see the decisions that are being made or how they're being made. And that goes all the way through like ethics complaints, all the way to this situation here. They don't have a direct route for you to talk to them for ethics. You have to go to an outside source that's run by two old people in Florida. Like, there is an issue with transparency and them being able to communicate with us as members and not just as certificates. And that is something they absolutely don't do. And they absolutely try to punt it off to ABAI and to the professional organizations without acknowledging that the power that they are able to exhibit against in these policy ways. So I think they did it wrong. I understand why it happened. I don't think it happened correctly, and I do think it could have been done differently.
Yeah, I think transparency was the biggest thing there, because again, like I'm not in those rooms. I don't doubt that navigating these, none of us are. 12 people are. Who they are, don't know. How many are lawyers? I'm being snarky, but yeah, that's the big thing. If they had come out like, listen, y'all, we are really trying to navigate these oppressive, discriminatory systems as best we can. You should still be mindful of the marginalized identities of your clients, of your supervisees. If they were so for real, I would have more respect for it. But right now it's just like, we can't have ABI do that. I'm like, okay, what use to you? It sounds like you're just kind of a money pit a little bit. And it leaves me really with no respect for that. I mean, I have my own thoughts on certification and so forth, but I think transfer would have been such a key part of that, because it's, what was it, like a paragraph or two that just sounded like uptight business person, and like, could you just be so for real? Like, just speak to us like we're people, because we are. And we're
highly educated people that can handle the truth. And it's
Right.
it's very much like this hands-off idea, except for we do have the power to remove your ability to practice. We do have the power to suspend your ability to practice. We have all this power, but we don't recognize it, and we operate in like the shadows and then come out with our answers. And that lack of transparency is so bad for our field whenever stuff like this happens, because
Sure.
it happens and then it necessitates additional conversations from people who are generally not in the room, or these short explanation podcasts that come out and say, oh, well, we're mad too. Cool. But that's still not what we're looking for, is an acknowledgement that you're sad about it too. And what we're looking for is leadership. And the BACB is not willing to be leaders, in my opinion.
11 minutes. 11 minutes to cover. I mean, I think that just says
Yeah.
a lot too. 11 minutes to cover this major decision that people are very much mad at you about. And it seems like it was an attempt to, like cover, like people got real mad. Oh no.
Sure,
Again, was that,
sure.
did they plan it from the start? Maybe, I don't know. I'm not in the room. But, if the ultimate goal of the BACB is to, uphold the well-being and the competency and so forth of our clients and our people, like, do it right now. You're not doing it. That's my opinion.
Yeah. I hope if there is a message from everybody out there that they take to heart, it is, okay, if the university can't have it in part of their framework, do it, the field supervision framework, have that something that you do with your supervisor. And that way it's done in a way that, okay, it's not an extra training that we're requiring, but it's just part of, that education, because I am not going about any individual programs. And I think people tend to get what they want out of an educational situation. But we have people who are working on their field work that come in and can't give a technical definition of, reinforcement, and we're having to train them from step one. If we're doing that anyways, then we might as well be going over these things too, since they weren't getting everything they needed from their educational program. So hopefully there is a way, and hopefully they're actually working on it. And it's not just, as it seems, that it was performative in the first place and now we're taking it away and we're done with it. But I guess only time can tell from that.
Yeah, I guess that's a way to kind of like, this is some, I'm not going to swear, some BS.
You can swear, it's okay.
Some bull Skinner. But I still like take it with that, just because there's not a specific CU requirement anymore. It's not necessarily in your program. You're still, if a listener is in university, you still have access to DEI articles in our journals.
Right.
Talk to your supervisors, go to talks related to DEI. You can still, unfortunately at this point, it's just the onus is gonna be on the practitioner a lot of the time. And, you do have to consider these marginalized identities as you work with not just your clients, with stakeholders, with your own supervisees, with your colleagues. You work with people, again, in some capacity, whether it's directly as a client, or you're working with lab mates. You're going to work with gay people. You're going to work with people of color. You're going to work with a lot of different people. And you need to be able to practice in a culturally sensitive and competent way. And you can still, search for those learning opportunities, through things like academia, through your supervised training experience, finding mentors, things of that nature. So I'm not to take away from a little bit of doom and gloom, like you can still do stuff. And you should.
I wonder with the universities and the pressure they're under, whether anybody's looking into what the professors are doing too, and if that would even be a danger. Because I know we had a professor, I say we because there's a few of us on the call that had a professor that it was at the time when affirmative action was deemed to be unconstitutional. And they're like, we don't care, screw it. We're doing this anyways, and be damned what happens. I have tenure. You know what I mean? And so I don't know if there'll be anybody coming after them or looking into it, but hopefully some of the professors are out there saying, no, this is BS. Let's do it anyways,
I hope so. And that's kind of like, to bring it back to our paper, like, it's great to say that we are doing that thing, or we're not these bad practitioners, but when what's written down says something differently, it is difficult for us to fight back that our science is relevant and all of these other things when we are still trying to fix the errors and discuss the errors or not be allowed to discuss the errors of the past. It really prevents us from looking like a modern science if you Google us. Like I keep coming back to that, but when you are an outside person looking for services, and if you were to Google ABA, it's very mixed bag of what you're going to get in your results. And it's very difficult to argue against the things that people have issues with if we don't know about them, if we aren't talking about them, and if we aren't creating literature and things that are counter to our previous behavior as a field.
And I was going to get into that too. Sorry, Abby, to interrupt you, but that's something that you talk about in the article. I know Cody's article talks about something similar is like, DEI, no DEI, position statements, no position statements, retractions, no retractions. There's still not a lot of LGBTQ representation in our literature base. There's a lot of, the old stuff on conversion therapy. Other than that, there's not a ton. I know that's something that you both are aiming to change, but is that one of a potential solution to this, like going forward, like, hey, we may have DEI, we may not, but let's get more people represented in our literature base?
In our literature base, but also I would really like to see it generalize into our ethics community, into the different types of people who are making decisions. It's really frustrating for me to go to ethics panels and everyone is white, everyone is over the age of 50, and no one is currently practicing. They're all in academia. I think it's disingenuous to think that those voices can speak for modern problems we may be experiencing during practice. I just think there needs to be more voices in the room. If you want to keep the old guys in the room, that is okay. They come with a ton of institutional knowledge, but we need to get more representation. And for me, what I would really like to see is younger, early career opportunities for people to be involved in these conversations, because I think the other way that the BACB as a whole could really benefit is making it appear and be more transparent, giving more people voices. They do a lot of sneaky things when they're trying to release things, like shortening the time for responses or releasing it on a Friday so it kind of just disappears. And they do a lot of stuff like that. And they need to knock that off and bring in the younger voices, the people who are interested in making these changes, because if they can be actively involved in the change, then it is easy for us to say we aren't doing that anymore. But if it's just statements written by faceless people, myself included, I am on the ABAI position statement and we all got a little mention at the bottom, but even that crowd, you only got in if somebody knew somebody. And that kind of extension of subject matter expert does not invite practitioners to join the conversation.
So, gotcha. Abby, you looked like you were going to chime in there a little bit. Did we miss anything?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's also like hey, we need to know what this history is of conversion therapy practices, because when people call ABA conversion therapy, not just for queer people, but they also refer to it in the context of people with autism. You can't really argue if you don't really have the information. It's like, how do you apply an intervention without knowing the function? I kind of take that same approach. Can't really argue that it's not conversion therapy if you don't know where the root of their argument comes from. But I also think, beyond we don't do that anymore. Here's some statements on things promote developing tools for practice, more research to show, hey, not only are we just not doing that thing anymore, because that's kind of the bare minimum. Here's some things that we're doing to actually support these communities is also kind of a critical step. I would say it's not just, that beyond hey, we don't do that anymore. Which, right. I think we could have a whole conversation on what is conversion therapy, because I think that also is kind of a gray area where I think if we surveyed a lot of practitioners and said, are you doing conversion therapy with your clients? Most would say no. But right. I think if you start asking questions like, hey, have you ever had a client whose parents didn't really like them playing with a certain toy, and you went along with it. And maybe this child was, AMAB, assigned male at birth, and that item was a Barbie doll or something, as a very common example. Is that full-on conversion therapy? Maybe not, but it's on a spectrum of something not good, and
Sure.
Those are just things to think about. I think in those kind of situations, you may get a little more people being like, well, yeah, I did kind of do something like that, and I don't think that's okay. Is it, Clockwork Orange in a chair? No, it's still not okay. It's still on a spectrum of concerning behavior that I think practitioners just maybe don't think about. And I don't necessarily blame them, because we don't really talk about them. We historically have not talked about them much as a field. These conversations are kind of newly happening, but those are some things to consider that, don't just go, well, I'm not doing conversion therapy, I'm doing good. Okay, what are you actually doing to support it, for one? And let's just check in to make sure our practices are good, ethical, and for the well-being of the client.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
that may take a little bit more conversation too, because now as you speak of it that way, those of us that work in the realm of severe behavior, I mean, we are often changing behavior that the individual doesn't necessarily want to change. And so again, where are we on that continuum as well? If you have someone who's dangerous to other populations, but do we have the right to then change their behavior without them wanting to? And so I guess we need a dividing line of where is it acceptable, where is it not. And so I think only society can give us that as well. You know what I mean? I always tell everyone when we're doing these episodes, like, I'm sure that we're taking statements. I hope I'm being an advocate. I hope I'm being supportive. As a cisgender white male, I feel like I have very little right to talk in any of these areas and voices, but I want to be as supportive as possible. But I'm sure there's something that I take a stance on now that 100 years from now I would have been canceled for. And so trying to figure out where that line is, I think only society can tell. But I'm hoping the work you all are doing, at least in our field, if more than anything, is shifting that view and that focus and the cultural norms to being one of, hey, we need to address these issues so everybody has the inclusion and can be treated fairly, really.
Well, that's long been the biggest issue, in my opinion, with social significance, is that is a standard that is constantly moving, and it implies that there is like a moral standard that we all agree on. And there are basic tenets: don't kill, don't hurt, don't steal. But that's about where the black and white ends and the gray begins. When we are now looking at things like LGBTQ identity and individuals with autism as part of their identities, and if it is an identity behavior or just presentation, then we are challenging people to take a step back. You see that with stereotypy interventions and those types of things. We're recognizing like what is actually socially significant and asking ourselves that again. I always want us to be asking that, but I think we fall into a dangerous trap of, well, society knows. That is not always true. And that is a really difficult standard to meet, especially when we're also in the same conversation talking about how we're getting rid of DEI. Society doesn't always set the standard appropriately.
Yeah.
And so with severe problem behavior, absolutely, it's pretty, I don't want to say easy, but it's pretty obvious. Assaults, self-injury, all those very significant behaviors are not identity-based and they are dangerous. But it's when you start getting identity-based things that we should all be just taking a step back and recognizing. Sexual assault is not an identity. So that is something that we would want to deal with. It has nothing to do with their actual sexuality, or because sexuality is normal for everyone. It's the expression of it that is incorrect. And so in my opinion, like, my line is identity. Take a step back and is this behavior identity based? And that still doesn't always mean it's okay, but very rarely do I find an identity based behavior that is socially significant for change.
And it may also be thinking about like, because I feel like the common argument is like, oh, well, if so-and-so is wearing a dress or is playing with a they're going to get bullied. That's a risk. Okay, well, maybe you could teach resilience behaviors. What is, what can this client, like, could you sit down and have a real conversation with this client? It's obviously going to depend on, their age, verbal skills, and so forth. But like, if they're a teenager, like, hey, some people are dirtbags and they're going to say these rude things about you. And here, there's some recent articles, I believe, that's kind of start exploring resiliency skills. I think this is a great opportunity to begin merging in other fields like behavior analysis. Is not the end all be all. We need to hear from other fields. They have important things to say. They do stuff sometimes in a lot of places, and a lot of these, especially complex social behaviors, a lot better than we do. And so things like resiliency, like teaching skills related to that, like, hey, tell a teacher, tell your parent if somebody's bullying you, or say, that's not nice, don't say that to me, or, speaking up for themselves. There are other ways. Like, I know you want to mitigate, I don't want my client to be bullied, but it doesn't mean that you have to teach them to not wear the dress. Or,
because in that case, the bullying is not the most dangerous behavior. The bullying is dangerous. The lack of being able to accept your identity and being able to accept your person and have people around you being safe and supportive, that's what reduces the risk of suicide for LGBTQ teens. It is not hiding it. It's being able to have people around you that embrace it. And so the risk is so much higher to avoid bullying, because identity is going to be their identity in middle school and in high school and as an adult. They didn't get to pick it. So there really truly is like, I think that's it.
I'm thinking about this in turn, like, again, I'm in OBM, so we're thinking about picnics and performance, performance diagnostics. But I think people see bullying and they're like, oh, that's something that could immediately affect this client. Not thinking about these long-term, like, wow, if I teach this client to like hide their identity all of the time around all of the people, okay, it's not gonna, that's just gonna compound, and then in their 20s they may harm themselves. But people aren't thinking to those long-term severe consequences, because is it possible? Sure. Is it certain? I don't know. Like, you could do a whole picnic analyses on these, but these are things that behavior analysts really have to think about. You're only with the client for a brief period of their life. We have to kind of start thinking about beyond that as well, not just these kind of short-term, like,
And that protectionism mindset is absolutely like historic. I know when I came out, my mom was like, I don't want you to have a hard life. Like that is kind of that first, like, I don't want this hard thing for you. But the harder thing for me would have been to just keep not being myself. And so kind of recognizing the difference. And yes, socially for a long time, that is why we thought that intervening and doing conversion therapy and helping gay men become straight, we're doing that because they're highly depressed and they live in a dangerous society, and all these like seemingly very good reasons to intervene on the behavior of homosexuality. And that kind of thinking can get really dangerous. And I think that's kind of what we want to push back against, because it created the problem once before. And
Yeah, like what does it say about society that our best solution is to not address the bullying, but address protecting people from the bullying that we, essentially created.
That we're doing the bullying.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense.
And I think there's always some avoidance or escape on some of the people that are arguing that as well, because they don't understand or feel comfortable with things that are outside their norms. And so I'm supporting you, but also doing this because it's reinforcing to me as well.
Yeah, you had talked about like firm lines. I unfortunately, I know every person listening is just gonna like, oh no, I don't think that there's a firm line you can draw in every case. It's all gonna be dependent, because I think there are some situations where like, hey, I need to teach this client to discriminate safe from unsafe spaces, but that again, that is like, hey, if you see this, maybe be a little chill, but like, hey, here's some spaces, here's how you can identify safe spaces and safe communities and people to be around, because sometimes it's not, it's not the safest thing to be out. And you do, though, in those situations, like, hey, if I'm in a location and I just heard somebody, say a slur, I'm not going to say my pronouns are she, they. I'll be like, hello, I am she, her. I'm not even say that. I'm not going to correct anybody. But I then know, okay, well, I have my friends I can text to and who are also queer that I can, reach out to. So yeah, unfortunately, I think everybody's looking for like what's the single answer that applies to everything. And unfortunately, that will never be the case really in anything. Because even Sarah, you talk about thou shalt not steal. I'm like, I can think of some situations where stealing is totally fine.
Yeah, and firm line was probably the wrong terminology there, because it's always a continuum. There's always going to be gray areas everywhere. I think it's just trying to shift the idea of society as a whole to then say, no, these things are wrong, these things are right. Because right now, I think there's strong groups on each side, and there's a lot of people in the middle that it's not affecting them personally, and so they don't care. And my thought is education first, but then also how, as behavior analysts, can we shape that societal behavior in a way that isn't so salient that people push back? And that's kind of what I haven't seen much of in our field, but I would like to see more of, is how is it we can actually shape things in the traditional sense in a way that does not cause uproar. Because sometimes just standing up and talking, although it's good education, for those people that don't care or that are opponents, it just gives them more fuel,
I wish that we had a better ability within our field to do more panels of clients, more panels of people who are not necessarily in our profession, so they don't want to have to pay to get in, and they don't want to have to pay to do all this extra stuff, but actually hear from the people that we're serving. I think that's one of the biggest holes in the way that we educate ourselves as a field, is there is not enough voice from the people that we serve. Especially, there is a huge contingency of people who don't like ABA, and we just say we don't listen to them. Well, I disagree. We should listen to them, even if they're saying stuff that's mean, even if we think that they are wrong. We don't even give them a platform to discuss our field in negative ways. And I really think that is one of the areas that I think we would be better providers if we could actually hear from a trans person who's like, yeah, my therapist did this, this, and this, and it was really harmful to me. And not have our only example of us doing a bad and ending not well to be Riekers and Lovas. There are lots of people that we've done bad things to, maybe not me personally, but that doesn't mean I can't listen and take responsibility for our field not listening. And I think if we had more of those very personal things, I think more practitioners would be better at recognizing when we are crossing lines.
Yeah. Abby, you look like, were you going to chime in there? No.
No, I was gonna be like, yes, but
Yes.
I don't want to. I know we're getting towards the end, so I'm like, I don't know if you have another question, so I'm gonna.
Yeah, no, it's all good. It's all good. Yeah, we are kind of rounding out. If anyone else in the group has a question, feel free to chime in, raise hands. I was gonna see, just from a practical level, just get some. I know, Abby, you're doing some work, or you did some work on like an intervention on proper pronoun use. We've talked a lot about like what ABA shouldn't be doing. What are some other things that we as a field, it's a really powerful field, what can we be doing to help our folks who identify as LGBTQ+?
I mean, there's stuff we could do at different levels. Again, I'm an OBM, so I'm focusing largely on performers. But if you are a supervisor, a clinical director, whatever you may be, you play a large role in setting a lot of times the culture of things. What do you do if a stakeholder says, I don't want this trans supervisee working with my client? What do you do in that situation? Yeah, so there's, we could do kind of things at different levels. If we have policies that like, hey, if you ask us to do something with a client or say something that is, derogatory to our marginalized, identities, supervisees, we reserve the right to have, remove you from this clinic, from the session, or so forth. You kind of have to follow through with those policies. I think that's kind of a big thing. There's a lot of policies, but then they're not like always followed through. So, from an organization standpoint, setting those policies, setting up that culture for that. If you see your supervisees you hear a supervisee saying something messed up to another one, step in. Hey, that's not cool. Give feedback. Like, you are a supervisor for both their, how they work with clients, but also how they work with one another. Professional interactions are something that your supervisees do now and will continue to do. So you also must shape that up. Call out when you see something good. Hey, I saw that, you supervisee A, I saw that when you called out this other supervisee for doing something with a client in which you tried to correct them from playing with a doll. Like, I'm always pulling back to that one, but
yeah, sure.
Like, praising those types of inclusive behaviors in your supervisees, for example, being mindful of things like microaggressions and intervening on that. Those are very common, often seen as, lesser forms of discrimination, but they do have an impact. There's a lot of research that demonstrate that they're so much more common and that they can have sometimes a worse effect on people because they're just, they seem so quick and small. So people use them all the time. So being mindful of your supervisee's behavior and your behavior as well.
And being willing to have the conversations. I think that's one thing that from our paper on that I kind of like really want to encourage people. It can be uncomfortable to talk about trans people if you're not a trans person and don't know a trans person and you're just a guy supervising some guys. Like, that can be really difficult. I would really encourage people to have the conversation even when it's uncomfortable, or have people like Abby or me or whoever come in and talk very frankly and give spaces for practitioners to get it wrong in a controlled space so that when they are actually practicing, you've already thought of this situation. You've already thought of this scenario, or you're not afraid to say the word trans, or you're not, and because truly, like, leading those conversations, people are afraid of the language itself around LGBTQ people because it's very fluid, it's changing. Am I allowed to say that word? Or are you allowed to say that word? There are not a lot of spaces, especially for clinicians and practitioners, to have these really frank kind of off-color conversations that are actually truly required for us to be culturally competent. I need to know if a client says this thing, one, what does it mean? And two, should I be supporting or not supporting it? And in what ways can I be? Like, we spend a lot of time talking about like safety online for our clients, but are we teaching them how to interact with apps that largely would be considered unsafe, like Grindr? Like, we need to be able to think about those situations and have those conversations before we encounter them. And so really, as clinicians, I just wish there were more opportunities for us to get it wrong in a safe environment than to just being out in the field and then running into it and then going, oh no. To me, I think that would be our best. Like, I think we would change a lot of minds and hearts if we just could be able to talk about it and not get in trouble for saying the wrong thing.
More proactive approach.
Yeah, there's like a whole research potential in looking at, the common like DEI trainings. I have a lot of thoughts on them, but again, we have like 2 minutes, so I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. But I mean, what I know about behavior, what everybody knows, like specific expectations, generally better. So looking at the, articles and what other practitioners are doing to identify specific behaviors that you could engage in, things like feedback reception skills. There's some, I believe, a recent article teaching that in supervisees, but that can also be related to leadership. If your queer supervisee comes up to you and says, hey, you kind of said this and I didn't really appreciate that. How do you receive that feedback in a appropriate way and ensure that you don't do that again? It's because that's a second key point that people like miss. It's like, it's not just apologizing. You should apologize, sure. It's also the behavior change. If you keep doing it, you send another type of signal. So there are some, just think about critical behaviors you, again, can engage in. Some of that is, again, related to things like feedback reception skills, identifying microaggressions so that you can call them out, or, either as a leadership or as somebody who's a recipient of them. Using proper pronouns is a common one, and so forth.
And kind of on that note, and on kind of our last question here, BCBA is listening to this if they're, when this conversation's over, what's one thing that you hope people, if they're interested in learning more on how to help and be a better advocate, that they read or go listen to or start practicing? Like, what's kind of your final call to the behavior analytic community as this conversation comes to a close?
Obviously, you should read our paper. That's most important.
We'll definitely link it, so you got that.
And honestly, the Morris paper, I really think sets the historical foundation for what we're talking about. But for me, ultimately moving forward, if you're a BCBA or a trainee or a supervisor, it doesn't really matter. I would encourage you to make sure that there is a queer person in the room. And if you don't have one, call us, because it's one of those situations where it's very difficult to know if you're doing it right or wrong if there's no one to navigate those questions with you. It's so important. You know, we talk a lot about, like, if you don't know something, seek out supervision. This is exactly one of those situations. If you don't know something, you can absolutely Google anything about LGBTQ and 80% of the time find the right answer.
Yeah.
But what's important is to be able to talk to people who are modifying behavior as well, who are understanding different things, and have those conversations, or not be afraid to call and say, am I allowed to say this word even? Because there are those words. And so for me, it really is an access and being willing to just admit that you need supervision. There's some just really powerful things about ADA and the way that we've done things incorrectly, that if you access them, it will start the conversation rolling.
Awesome. Abby, any final departing words?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we're at a point where, you know, larger political systems and larger social systems and the systems within our own field of the board are not supportive, to say the least, of, you know, DEI. And that, of course, is relevant to working with LGBTQ plus people, either as clients or supervisees. But that does not mean that you, as a practitioner, as a researcher, just ignore LGBTQ plus issues as a whole. You can still practice, and you should still practice in a culturally responsible way. It's more difficult now, unfortunately. But, you know, I think people go into this field as BCBAs, I'm imagining mostly clinical, to help people. And so use that as your MO to find, get that information, get that mentorship. Again, like if you're, the ABAI SIG, we have a Instagram page. Like, I don't think they would be bothered if you're like send a DM, hey, I'm not part of ABAI, but like, do you have somebody I can refer to if I have a question on this?
Sure.
Get a queer in the room. You're going to have much better luck getting a queer in the room and getting sound ethical advice than calling the ethics hotline.
Yeah, don't do that.
Then contacting traditional academic people in ethics. This is not an area that I would give them the expertise.
Yeah, and I mean, when you talk to queer people, especially queer, fellow queer practitioners who again would have the, understanding and content and competency of this field, they may be able to identify some things that you may not be able to kind of look out. I know we just talked about things like, it goes beyond like if bullying, and that's your least concern here. But there might be some people listening who are like, I didn't even think about that. And if you're not queer, I mean, it's kind of understandable that maybe you wouldn't, but a queer person in the room could kind of give you that perspective. The expectation is never that you're going to know everything, because guess what? You can't, you never will. That information is always changing. And to be expecting people to be competent in every single thing at all times is an unreal unreal. You have 20 clients you got to work with, only so much time in the day. But seek out that information, double check, consult a queer person. Know when you can say no. A parent, or a stakeholder can come up and say, I don't want my client doing this. Can you intervene? You can say no. You can say that. You might not, with ever-changing policies and laws, we may start facing some difficulties of applying, LGBT plus sensitive programs. But you can still say no. Yeah, I'm not. Use the statement that falls outside of ethical practice for me. I cannot implement that procedure. That is a perfectly fine statement. You can say no. So that was a lot of things, but
Yeah, for our
Oh.
team here that's on this call, always feel comfortable saying no than that. And then if they have an issue, they can call me and I'll tell them to go to hell. But you guys be nice and I'll be the mean one.
yeah, and if you
We-
are a supervisor, a leader in the organization, you got to back up your people. If we have a supervisee that, that or somebody that's, I'm not going to implement that program, you need to have that person's back, because what do you teach that stakeholder? Oh, if I just keep escalating, I'm going to get what I want in the end. And, worst case scenario on your client is potentially the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
And I know nobody likes to think about that, but that is a reality. We have to face that reality. We can't just look at the short term. Oh, well, it's easier for me to say yes to this person right now because I'm uncomfortable confronting them. What are the long-term effects on this client? They could be very severe.
Sarah and
Yeah.
Abby, we're running out of time here. We would love to have you both back someday, as you continue your research and your doctoral candidates and all that good stuff. So thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Having us.
Yeah, thank you.
so much. We
Awesome.
love talking about this if it's not apparent. So we have lots to say.
Yeah, next time I'll hopefully have a doctor in front of the name.
Hey.
Perfect.